people were booted, and the anti-drilling people who were supposed to have been cowed by this got in. Anyway, he filed the suit. And interestingly enough, he didn't seek any kind of damages. He wrote it, when you're a lawyer, when you are a defendant, you play the cards that you're dealt. If I'm defending Mr. Colley from, we've got to be careful, littering. And somebody saw him, you know, supposedly saw him, because he would never do this, but somebody supposedly saw him throw a gum wrapper on the floor, on the road. Those are the cards that I'm dealt. When you're a plaintiff, when you bring a suit, it's called a plaintiff, generally. When you sue a town, it's called something else. But when you're a plaintiff, you get to pick the cards you're going to play. You even get to pick jokers. And if there are any lawyers in here, they will tell you that they know what I mean. You can put whatever you want in there. Mr. West's own papers say that his client spent $4.7 million on leases in Dryden, but he didn't ask for a penny. He didn't ask for a single penny of financial damages, even though he spent 3 weeks telling everybody he was going to sue for takings. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. All right, so Dryden, and by the way, when Dryden, anyway, so that's what happened in Dryden. I'll try to pick this up. Middlefield, basically the same thing, except in Middlefield, what happened, in Dryden, it was the person who leased, who spent the $4.7 million on leases, who sued. In Dryden, someone who had leased, a landowner who had leased, brought a suit against Middlefield. Dryden's in Tompkins County, I should have said that, and Middlefield is in Otsego County. Middlefield, most people know it better for the village they're in, which is Cooperstown, Baseball Hall of Fame. So you got Middlefield, the landowners bringing the suit, Dryden, the gas companies bringing the suit. They are identical suits. They are identical. In most lawsuits, you have a combination of law and facts. The facts are things like, was the light yellow or red when the car entered the intersection? That's a factual question. There's not a single factual question in either one of these lawsuits. And there's only one legal question, and it's identical. And it's whether or not it has nothing to do with the form of the law that Middlefield passed or that Dryden passed. All it has to do with is whether or not that gas mining statute that I showed you preempts or takes away the town's authority. So that happens last year. Meanwhile, towns are doing, some towns, you guys are having this, I don't know how long you've been having this, this question, but many towns have had this question for a year or so. And so towns are considering what they can do, whether there's anything they can do. A lot of people have said, don't do anything, don't do anything. They've shifted from saying, well, there's one case out there, then they shifted and say there are no cases out there, don't do anything until Dryden and Middlefield are passed, okay? So they want everybody to wait for Dryden and Middlefield. Well, on February 21, Dryden came down. Remember I told you that there are some people who say there's one case out there, and I said there's not a case, there's not a single case. The first line in the Dryden decision, now again, these are Supreme Court cases, these are the lowest, the trial, these are the only ones that have construed this. The first sentence in the Dryden decision is, this is a case of first impression. So the court agrees with me that no court anywhere in New York State has ever looked at this, all right? And what that case said, and what that said was, unequivocally, the gas mining statute doesn't preempt the town's authority to completely, this is a permanent law, we're just talking about moratorium with you guys. They said that gas mining statute does not take away or preempt the town's authority to completely ban operations relating to oil and gas. So you go from a situation where there is not a single case anywhere that speaks to this, and this case comes down and says, in language even plainer than this, Any New York State town who wants to, municipality, can completely ban this industry. That's what this case says. And I'll show you the significance of that in a minute, okay? Now, Tom West, who represents Anshoes, the person who brought the gas company that brought this, all along, he's been saying, I'm going to bring suit. I'm going to sue for takings liability. It's going to be millions of dollars. And if, heaven forbid, you know, he didn't say that's me, but if we lose, of course, we're going to take it all the way to the Court of Appeals. So the day this case comes out, February 21, the same day, at the end of the day, Tom West, who's a very, very, very good lawyer. That's really important to know here. He's not some kid. I don't know if you guys remember the Gore v. Bush decision. I happened to be at home, and I remember when it came out, and I remember they handed the decision to the Port Telephone, you know, some lawyer who was about a fifth-year lawyer. His name's Dan Abrams. I happen to know because I know who his father is, Floyd Abrams. So I follow him. Anyway, hands this to this poor kid, this long decision, and they got, you know, this is for the presidency, and this kid's under pressure, and he's flipping through it to the back, because lawyers know to go to the back, because that's where basically it says. That's not what happened here. Tom West is a very, very experienced lawyer. At the end of the day, he's had this thing for hours and hours. He's looked at it. It's not a long decision. He's looked at it, and he says publicly to the press, for attribution, I do not think that we are going to be appealing this decision. That's what he says on February 21, at the end of the day. He's not Dan Abrams looking through Bush v. Gore. He's had hours to look at it. And he says, I don't think we're going to appeal this decision. But he said, we are going to be bringing a takings claim. And it will be a very, very large takings claim. So that's the end of the day on February 21. On February 24, I'm going to let the cat out of the bag. On February 24, Middlefield comes down and says the same thing. But an hour and a half before Middlefield comes down, Tom West, now West is not representing, at that time, is not representing the plaintiff in Middlefield. He's just representing the plaintiff in Norwich, the gas company, which everybody will agree is the more sophisticated player here, more sophisticated than either town, certainly more, that's just how life is, business-wise. So he's got the most sophisticated client in the deal. On 221, he has said, I don't think we're going to appeal this. On 224, an hour and a half before Middlefield comes down, and again, Middlefield comes down and says the same way, he confirms that he says that I don't think we're going to appeal. And he says, he didn't say, I don't think, and we will not be bringing a takings claim. Now remember that he spent 3 weeks before he filed suit talking about the millions and millions, and his own papers said, the cards that he played said that his client spent $4.7 million. But he comes an hour and a half before Middlefield comes down. We are not, unlike I don't think, with the appeal, unequivocally, we are not going to be bringing a takings claim. He goes on to explain why they're not going to be bringing a takings claim, which, as far as I'm concerned, was only partial. There were a whole bunch of reasons beyond what he said. But he said, and here's the kicker, but I do think somebody will bring a takings claim somewhere in New York State someday. Okay? 224, Middlefield says the same thing. And Middlefield said something that I thought is pretty good. It explained it by saying the state maintains control over the how, while the towns maintain control over the where. That goes to the issue of whether you're too stupid to make this decision or whether you've got the right college degree. The people who need the right college degree are the people who talk about the how. But you don't get into that until you guys in the red make a decision about where. So that notion about we're not smart enough or you're not smart enough or you don't have the right degree is, excuse the French, BS. Now, so before this, they told everybody to wait for Dryden, wait for Middlefield to be appealed. I'm sorry, for the decisions to come down. The decisions came down, wasn't what they expected. Tom West, a very, very, very sophisticated and good lawyer. He's actually been ranked a super lawyer if you go to his website. This guy knows what he's doing. And he said publicly, I don't think we're going to appeal. And he has said without equivocation, we will not bring a takings claim. And he explained why. Okay? Now, on the issue of whether you should wait for this kind of law to pass a protective law, remember I told you we think it's really important that you pass it, if you're going to pass it, that if you do it before the S-Vice comes out, which I'm really saying before permits issue, but I'm using the terms equivalently, whether or not I should, but it's going to be pretty close. If you decide, because some people will say wait for the appeal of these cases, there's some interesting things you should know about the supposed appeal. I have had people, including people who, not this one, but people who film me, use the L word and call me a liar. But those cases are not on appeal. And I'm going to explain that to you in a minute. No matter who tells you otherwise, they're not. And experienced lawyers agree that if these are appealed, that final resolution will take at least 2 years if it goes to the Court of Appeals. Because you got to go to that middle level I talked to you about, and then you go to the Court of Appeals. There's no question, it's virtually inconceivable that the DEC will have begun to issue drilling permits. There are a lot of people who say they're going to do it by Labor Day. Who knows whether that's true? Okay? On this appeal, okay, and I'll explain why, and then I want to get back to the appeal issue. Waiting to pass a moratorium or protective law until after the DEC issues permits does two things. First of all, it deprives your town of the only protection, the single protection for local control that the DEC has built into the S-Guides. And that's the right to check that box that says a proposal to frack in your town is inconsistent with local land use laws. More importantly, this is the single most important slide in my presentation. So I'm going to pause for a quote so people can read it, even though I'm going to read it out loud. We believe waiting is not the financially prudent thing to do. We believe that waiting to pass a protective law until after permits issues actually exposes the town's taxpayers to hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars of potential liability. I know that's a big range, but it depends on property values in the town. Liability that does not exist or would be dramatically lessened if the town passed a protective law before the permits issue. And I'll explain why. The difficulty of proving and conversely defending a regulatory takings or what's called a vested rights claim changes dramatically depending upon whether the law, which would be the alleged regulatory taking, being challenged was enacted before or after the DEC issues permits. You see what this next thing is before I decide whether. Okay. So let me tell you briefly what a taking is. I can't do this briefly, and I'm sorry, but it's important. There are two kinds of takings. The first kind of takings, everybody on a board like this typically knows about, and every town lawyer knows about. And it is basically eminent domain. What the Constitution says is that the government may take private property for a public purpose, but you have to pay what's called just compensation. So you may take private property for a public purpose, but you got to pay just compensation. So eminent domain is what everybody knows about, most people know about, and all the lawyers know about. And it's things like taking 100 feet in front of your house to widen a road, or taking 10 feet from your side yard for just 30 days for a construction easement. Those are takings, and you will never have a lawyer argue that they're not a taking, because the sovereign, the government, has physically kept the owner away from that by taking it. The only thing lawyers fight about in that situation is the just compensation. And they fight like cats and dogs. Every lawyer knows that. You got to know that to pass the bar. That's like basic stuff. That's not the kind of taking that people are talking about here. The kind of taking that people are threatening when they say, if you pass this, it's a taking, is a different animal. It's called regulatory taking. And most people, with due respect, most people on town boards they haven't seen that. They don't know what it is. Very importantly, a super majority, way over 50% of lawyers have no clue what it is. It's not tested on the bar exam. Most of them never see it. The United States Supreme Court has described the area of regulatory takings as among the most very complicated areas of jurisprudence that it deals with. So half these people out there, more than half of the non-lawyers, and more than half of the lawyers who are saying that's a taking, have no clue, have not done it. I've read every single regulatory taking case there is. I've had the luxury of being able to do just this for 3.5 years. And it ain't a regulatory taking. Look at me. I am not a hippie. I am not some tree hugger. If I told you who my old clients were, you would be, I'm a very conservative person, borderline OCD, which is really good in my business because you got to be so careful. I come from a business where if you put a comma in instead of a semicolon, it can cost somebody money. In my business, somebody put a comma in the wrong place, not at my firm, but somebody else, and it cost the firm $6 million. All I have done my entire career until I did this, my entire legal career until I did this, was exclusively very large dollar amounts, usually complex but transactions, but always large dollar amounts. I'm a very conservative person. So when I tell you what the law is, if I say I don't know, but you can take it to the bank. And as I said before, we can go back, because lots of people have taken every single thing I have said about the law for the last 3 years has been true. Those cases I showed you on Dryden and Middlefield, when Dryden came down, there were lawyers from Chicago who called me and said that it looked like my wife and I wrote the decision. And what they meant by that wasn't just that we got it right how they did it, that the court held exactly the way we said that they would. And the reason we were able to do that is because, and I'll tell you what I tell people, we have the law on our side. We're not making the law here. The reason I could do that with that confidence is because this is the law. In order for me to be wrong about this, somebody has to change the law. That's the only reason I can be so confident. All right? Now, let me get into regulatory takings. Let me give you an example. The best thing to do is an example. On the other side of this wall, let's envision, please, 500 feet of vacant property. I happen to own it. And on the other side of that 500 feet is whatever kind of water you like. I like beach, but you might like river, or you might like lake. And you guys, in your knowledge and authority and goodwill, you decide that you are going to pass a law, a land use law that says, and it's not that no one can build anything right there. You can't target me. You can't do that with law. You can only target the property. And let's say you're going to pass a law that nobody can build anything. And you're going to pass out, and the reason's going to be that you want everybody else to be able to see the water, okay? Water view. Let's not, you'd have to have a proper public purpose, and we would all fight about that, but let's forget that. Let's pretend you got that's a proper public purpose, okay? In that situation, if you pass that law that way for that reason, that would be a taking. Even though I told you moments ago that to get it to have a taking in an eminent domain context, you've got to have a physical dispossession by the sovereign. You've got to actually take the property away from the person. Here you haven't taken it away from me. Okay, it's still mine, but I can't do anything with it. But that's a taking. And the law, and it's a regulatory taking. The difference between eminent domain is that you haven't physically taken it, you've passed a law. The reason that it's a regulatory taking is that you have left me with basically nothing I could do with that property. Let's say before I like oceans, so let's say it's an ocean. Let's say before you did that law, I could have built a condo there, and I could have sold that condo for $2 million condo units for $2 million in profit, and you pass that law, that's a taking. You either have to grandfather me, which you're not, or you have to write me a check for $2 million. That's what people are threatening when they say this is a taking. But let's say you had done this differently. Let's say you had talked to a lawyer first. The lawyer would have said, look, tell him that all he can build is a 2,000 square foot structure not to exceed 1 story high. That does what you're trying to do because everybody can see the water. That's not a taking. And let's say that what I could do with that is a clam shack that I could sell for a profit of $500,000. That's not a taking. It might seem like that should be a taking of $1.5 million, right? Because before I could have made a $2 million profit on the condo. Now I've got an asset that I can sell for $500,000 profit. That's not a taking at all. It may not be fair, but it's not, because the law of regulatory taking is whether or not after this law has passed, after the supposed regulatory taking has passed, whether there's more than de minimis value, basically more than a sliver of value. Doesn't sound fair, but that's the law. If there's more than a sliver of value left, it's not a taking. So by letting me do that 2,000 foot structure that I could do a clam shack on, you left me more than a sliver of value. Now change my hypothetical. Let's assume it's not unimproved land. Let's assume it's a dairy farm. And you pass this law. Everything you could have done before you can do. There's one little thing you can't do, which is unconventional gas drilling. That is much more than a sliver of value, and that's why we could look the people in the eye and say, that ain't no taking. Okay? Let me come back. Okay. Bear with me, please. Now, the other thing people say is, as I said before, they used to say wait for Dryden and Middlefield. Then they used to say, okay, wait for them to be appealed. I've even seen, what's this? No idea what this is. My son was using this computer. Sorry. There we are. Now they say wait for the appeal. Actually, remember I told you Tom West is the guy who represented Dryden. Tom West has told people that he still, Anschutz in the Dryden case, he still represents Anschutz. He's told people in the paper that he's probably going to be representing Middlefield as well in the appeal. He's told people that he's going to what's called consolidate or put together the cases of Dryden and Middlefield. It makes perfect sense, by the way, because they're identical, as I told you, identical cases. And he's also predicted that there's going to be a decision in the appeal come September. That's what I've seen him predict in print. But guess what? That's nonsense. He hasn't appealed. In New York State, appealing is 2 steps. The first thing you do is when you lose, is you file something called a notice of appeal. Despite the name of that thing, notice of appeal, it ain't an appeal. All the notice of appeal does is give you the right to appeal sometime in the next 9 months. It's not an appeal. To appeal, you have to what's called perfect an appeal. All right? So they filed notices of appeal, but as of 1:32 p.m. when I called the court, not a single piece of paper has been filed to perfect an appeal. When you file a notice of appeal, it doesn't mean you intend to appeal. It doesn't mean that it's likely that you're going to appeal. It doesn't mean you've even thought about appealing. If you go to the civil practice books, it'll tell you, as soon as you lose, file an appeal, whether or not you're going to appeal. It's almost malpractice not to, because if you don't do it right away, you might forget. But it's not an appeal. So they filed notices of appeal, but they haven't. Now think about that. There's no decisions out there. There were no decisions either way that said anything about this. Certainly nothing that said you didn't have authority. Now there are two court decisions, 2 different courts, 2 different counties. They're not high courts, but that's all that's out there. So that's all that's out there. Both of them say unequivocally that if a town wants to, they can, never mind, I know we're talking moratorium here, which is temporary, but if a town wants to, it can permanently keep this industry out altogether. Now, you tell me what you would do. You don't need to be a lawyer. What would you do under those circumstances? It's 6 months now. The first one came down on 2/21, the second one came down on 2/24. It's 6 months and they haven't appealed. Now, if it were me, and I thought I believed I would win, I'd be in court the next day. And I would be doing what's called an expedite. I would do what I needed to do to get the court. I would convince them, or try to convince them, that this, which I think I could do, I think anybody could do, that given the importance of this issue, public policy-wise, that they needed to consider this thing ASAP. That's what I would do if a decision like that, if I represented this industry or just even one company, came down. It's 6 months and they haven't done anything. Now, that's what I would do if I thought I could win. Even if I didn't think I could win, I'd still go in like that, because I would BS them and I would want them to think I could win. I'm going all over the state, having discussions like this, pointing out that they haven't appealed. And for most people, it usually carries some weight. There's only one reason they haven't appealed. And it's the same reason that at the end of the day, on February 21, Tom West said publicly, I don't think we're going to appeal this. When you're a lawyer, not always, but sometimes, this is one of them, you don't even have to be a party to the suit. You can look at the legal decision and you can figure out, if you're an experienced lawyer, that if somebody does appeal, is it likely or not that they're going to win? This is one of those decisions. That's why he said that. So you can listen to anybody you want. You can listen to the questions that we're going to get. There ain't no appeal. It's 6 months, and you don't need to be a lawyer. If you were on the other side and these decisions came down and there's not one single case in your favor on the other side, would you be appealing that yesterday? I would. But they haven't. And again, this same guy who hasn't, Tom West, is telling people we're going to have a decision in September. You can't say you're going to have a decision in December until you know when the hearing is, when you're in front of the judge. And you can't possibly know when you're going to be in front of the judge if you haven't perfected your appeal. Will they appeal? I don't know. What I've heard, what he has said, what Tom West has said, is his client has no interest in an appeal, and they're trying to find somebody to step into their shoes to buy their position to do the appeal. It might be Norse who's struggling to survive. It might be landowners who are pulling their hair out at these decisions, or should be. Some of them I know they are. But that's what he said. And that's the most sophisticated player here. They're more sophisticated than the towns, I promise you. They're more sophisticated than this woman who I'm sure is very nice, who fought the plaintiff from Middlefield. This is a very sophisticated cat, this Philip Anschutz. And by the way, sometimes when you lose a lawsuit, you might think you can win, but you don't appeal because you don't have the money. That happens in real life. That's why I brought up how much Anschutz has. He's worth like $36 billion. The most it would cost to appeal this thing, all the briefs are done. All the briefs are done. They're the same briefs, I promise you. If they do appeal, you'll see the briefs. The most it could cost on both levels is $150,000, which is a lot, but this guy spent $4.7 million. So I'm here to tell you, having represented serious money in the past, that if somebody thinks they can get their $4.7 million back by spending $150 or $250, if their lawyer tells them it's a winner, they're going to do it. You do not walk away from $4.7 million if you don't have to, in my humble opinion. So Tom West has said repeatedly and publicly that his client, the plaintiff, does not want to appeal, probably will not appeal, and is hoping to find someone who might want to step into the plaintiff's position. by the way, I open every single one of my presentations like this the way I did tonight, which is to say anybody who wants this can have a copy of it. If I said things like this and they were untrue, they'd pull my bar, and should pull my bar card just like that. You can take all of this stuff to the bank. As recently as 6/13, Mr. West said, as to the problem, again, this guy loves a microphone. You put a microphone in front of him and he talks. He said it could be a tall order to prevail after 2 trial courts have ruled against us. The odds are against us, he said. So if anybody does say to you, wait for the appeal, I don't think there's going to be an appeal. And if there is, here's what the go-to guy in New York State for the gas industry says about his own prospects. And again, I couldn't say this. They would yank my bar card in 2 seconds. I give this out to anybody who wants it, including Mr. Collin. So you can bank on this stuff.
We have this memorized.
I know. They've heard some of this before. So supporters of the industry admit that part of the reason the lawsuits were filed, the Dryden lawsuits, was to have a chilling effect. That's Tom West's own words. On the movement to enact town-level moratorium bans. What they don't tell you is that what they are at least as concerned about is when a protective law is enacted. They're as concerned about that as whether. Because we believe the real goal of their present legal challenge, this is an old slide, there is no legal challenge, is to forestall the enactment as of as many bans and moratoria as possible until after the permits issue. Because again, we don't concede, by the way, we absolutely do not concede that if you pass a protective law after the permits issue, we do not concede that that's a regulatory taking. We believe it's not, but it's a lot easier to win the lawsuit if you pass the law. I mean, it's a no-brainer, we think, to win the lawsuit if you pass a protective law beforehand. So, I've already said this, consideration as to whether a moratorium should be enacted, or if you go that way, a decision to enact a moratorium does not mean that the board has made up its mind about whether gas drilling is appropriate for this town. The only thing it means, the only thing a moratorium means, is that it's in the best interest of the town as a whole to study and gather more information to help make an informed decision. You want to talk about compulsory integration?
Actually, I do.
You do?
I know what it is.
Okay. So, many people assume that companies are legally allowed to frack only on properties where they have obtained leases. And that if you don't want to allow your property to be used for fracking, or you haven't yet decided, you can stop them from doing so. Okay? In other words, a lot of people think that if you haven't signed a lease, or if you haven't decided yet whether you want to allow them on, that you can stop them from using your property. This is not the case in New York State. And this is because of something called compulsory integration. New York law provides that fracking companies are not limited to using only property that they have leased. They are not limited. And in fact, industry proponents, senior industry proponents, generally concede that they might not be able to drill profitably at all unless they are also allowed to invoke compulsory integration to be able to use the property of people who have not leased. This goes directly to the issue in case somebody might think we don't want to do a protective law because it's unfair to tell Joe what to do with his property. If you don't do a protective law, Joe can force Joe's neighbor, and I'll show you how, to allow his property, her property, to be fracked, and I'll show you how. Compulsory integration is a two-part process. First, spacing units are established. And essentially, a spacing unit is the area that the fracking company wants to drill under. In Marcellus, it's anticipated that they're going to be a square mile, which is 640 acres for a spacing unit. Next comes the actual compulsory or forced integration component. So long as the fracking company provides an unnotarized affidavit, most people think, some people in the front row don't agree, but most people think I'm a pretty smart guy, and I am a pretty smart guy. I don't know what an unnotarized affidavit is. I'm not smart enough to tell you what an unnotarized affidavit is. But I know how it got there. The law must have said affidavit, and the lobbyist for the gas company wrote in unnotarized. So they come up with an unnotarized affidavit, which means it doesn't have to be true, not even to the best of their knowledge, that they control at least 60% of that spacing area, 384 acres. And if they do that, then owners of the remaining 40% of the property, 256 acres, are legally required to allow the driller to frack under their land. Nobody wants you to know about this, and I'm going to show you something in a minute that should blow your mind. It blows my mind. It should blow the mind of the people in the front row. So, the frackers come in, it doesn't have to be true. Nobody checks it. The DEC doesn't check it. It doesn't even have to be under pains and penalties of perjury. It's not notarized. They simply sign a piece of paper. They give the DEC a piece of paper that they control 60%. And then the other 40%, 256 acres, are legally required to allow the driller to frack under their land. Unbelievably, the compulsory integration law does not provide compensation for using this land to the people who are forced to participate. They may receive royalty-type payments depending on production, but they don't receive anything for using the land, for being on your land. This, by the way, makes it, and no matter who shakes their head, this is exactly right, and this is why this is unconstitutional. We will soon be filing a lawsuit very, very shortly to attack this as this is a taking, because there's no payment when they go under your property. There's no payment when they put the drill bit there. There's no payment when they leave the chemicals there. There's no. They like to talk about part of the reason that some of the people say, well, there's never been a problem with fracking. It's how it's Bill Clinton. It depends on what is. They define fracking to be that one split second when the thing is exploded and, okay? That one split second happens under your land here. And there is no compensation for it. The only compensation, the stuff they leave under there, there's no compensation for it. Each one of those, because there's no compensation, is a taking. And if lawyers were allowed to bet on the law, which they're not, I would bet people a beer on that, because I'm confident of that. Just as confident as I was when I said how Dryden was going to come down and Middlefield was going to come down. So they might get a payment if they pull some gas out, but not otherwise, okay? And I'll explain to you how this got in the law. It doesn't belong here with respect to shale gas. Now, I want to show you something about how important it is to people, to the industry, that nobody know about compulsory integration. I wrote an article, a letter to the editor, a little while ago, they sent all across the state. And it got picked up by a lot of places. And I pointed out that just what I said to you about this compulsory integration. Marcellus Drilling News, by the way, which is a adamantly pro-fracking blog, answered and said that as much as it killed them to agree with me about anything, me personally, they agreed with what I just told you, my assessment of what I told you compulsory integration was, okay? Now, the granddaddy of blogs in this industry is Energy in Depth Marcellus. It is funded by, if you deep down, it's funded by big gas, okay? Their main guy, they have very nice people working for them, but their main guy is a guy named Tom Shepstone. He runs EID Marcellus. So, on August 8th, that's not a good picture of it, it's kind of foggy, I didn't do that on purpose. I really didn't. He was actually a good-looking guy. So somebody in Oxford sent around 20 questions that they wanted answered. And like I said, this guy's all over everything. He got the questions. This is the first page. This doesn't have anything to do with what I'm going to show you here, except he's calling your neighbor a small pond, Oxford. But this is a lead-in to what I'm going to show you. The next slide is when somebody said, well, what about compulsory integration? I want to show you. They say lawyers twist things. This guy is not a lawyer. Look at this. This is the question. I'm showing up here. You can't see it. There was no way. I asked my wife. There was no way to get it full screen. So I showed you there so you know I'm not that I copied it. But then I had to type it over again. This is, in my opinion, outright deception. In my opinion, outright deception. And this is by the head of EID, Marcellus. Question 5. What adjacent properties will be affected by Albany's compulsory integration of the leaseholder's land into his contract and gas drilling business? Deception 1. Albany, trying to paint it that it's the state. You know who wrote this part? Tom West. Okay? He brags about it. It's on his site. So Tom West wrote this for the gas industry, the stuff we're talking about. But let's look at the meat of this. Here's Tom Shepstone's answer. No landowner can be forced by compulsory integration to enter into a gas lease. Nobody ever said they could. Or to permit natural gas well pads on their property. In my opinion, that's deceptive. He goes on to say, DEC's integration order will not give the well operator the right to enter your property. In my opinion, that's deceptive. Nobody ever said they could put a well pad on it. What I said, and I've said all along, is that they can drill under your property. And that's what they want to do. So he looks you in the eye, the head of EID Marcellus, looks you in the eye and tells you not to worry about compulsory integration because no one's going to come put a well pad on your property. The issue isn't a well pad on your property. The issue is that the well pad on your neighbor's property, they're going to snake the thing under your property and explode the chemicals, the fracking. And they're going to leave them there. They don't pull them back out. They pull some out, but they leave them there. And there's no compensation for that. If there's some gas, they'll give you compensation, but there's no compensation for that. So what I have said all along, every single thing I wrote in my letters to editors, everything else, is that they go under your property. And this is a head of EID, Marcellus. So, yeah, in my opinion, that's deceptive. I started out as a securities lawyer in Texas. The second deal I did was a $2.2 billion deal for an oil company in 1981. I started as a securities lawyer. If this were a securities matter, this would be fraud. Okay? That's compulsory integration. So, they go in, you're worried about the people who want to frack. If you don't stop this thing, the people who don't want to frack are left with that. And the people who you should be able to trust for supposedly unbiased information, I can't go backwards, if you go to EID's site, that's what you get. Oh, don't worry about it. They're not going to put gas well pads on there. So I just found this morning, so that's why I'm a little worked up. This you haven't seen before.
Yes, I have.
You're not for me.
No, not for me.
Not for me. Okay, very briefly, that's CI. Very briefly, road protection schemes that I am not an expert on. I just want to say two things. Whatever you do with a moratorium, if you do a moratorium, if you don't, we strongly recommend that you do consider some kind of road protection scheme. We can't do that. With this other stuff we can do for you for no fee. We can't do this. We're not competent to do that. Just want to talk about what the two things are. There are road use agreements. Road use agreements are a good thing. Most counties, especially counties like this county, that I consider to be generally pro-drilling, most counties, those kind of counties want a road use agreement and they tell you to stop after that. We think that's wrong. And we think instead of listening to the county planning people, you should ask a lawyer. Because a road use agreement is just what it sounds like. It's an agreement, it's consensual, it's volitional. You can't force anybody to go into it. The only people who are going to go into it are people who have an incentive to go into it. You don't get pass-through traffic, you don't get any of that stuff. So it's a great idea, but it doesn't protect you sufficiently. If you're interested, I can tell you how the counties got here, because I happen to know how. But that's I think where your county is, a lot of it, but that's not sufficient. We think you also need something called a road use law. A road use law is what it sounds like. It's mandatory. And if you tie the two together correctly, what you can do with your road use law is you can say anybody who enters, the road use law might be, I'm making this up, 10 sections. Section 8 might say anybody who has entered into, 1 through 7. Section 8 might say anybody who's entered into a road use agreement with us doesn't have to worry about sections 2 through 7 of this law. So it's both a carrot and a hook to get them into that road use agreement that you want, that is a good thing. But without a road use law, depending on your personality, you can call it a carrot or a stick. Without a road use law, you don't have any way to get them to go into that agreement, other than the fact, the trust me. And there are some towns that have said don't do anything. There's a lot of disagreement about what happens with this industry, what doesn't happen. The president of Chesapeake, no less an authority than the president of Chesapeake, has said publicly, we get accused of a lot of things. Most of the things we're accused of, we're not guilty of. We do destroy roads. That's a quote. Not damage, destroy. We do destroy roads. So our view is that at a minimum, whatever you do, if you don't want to do a moratorium, whatever, at least consider doing road protection. And if you do road protection, don't rely on your county as to whether road use agreements are sufficient. Ask a lawyer. If your lawyer says it's good, it's good. Don't rely on the county's lawyer to say it, because they're boxed in for reasons that I can tell you later. Ask your lawyer whether the road use agreement is sufficient. And that's all I've got.